Hello, I'm Ollie and this is CriminOlly, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today, why The Bighead by Edward Leigh succeeds where so much extreme horror fails. So I've been deliberately trying to read a bit more extreme horror recently, partly because where I've read extreme horror in the past, I've often been disappointed by it. It's often felt to me like it doesn't really have a point other than to be extremely graphic and shocking. And one of the books I was really keen to read was The Bighead by Edward Leigh. So this is an extreme horror novel that's really highly praised within extreme horror circles. It came out in 1997, so nearly 30 years ago, and it's still considered to be like a classic of that subgenre. And I agree with that assessment of it. I thought it was a really good, really well written, really interesting book. And I think that it's a book that justifies the violence, the graphic nature of its content by having something a bit more to say as well. So I'm going to talk in this video about why I think it is so good, and also about what some of my problems with some of the other extreme horror that's out there are. So let me start by telling you a bit about the book and its plot. So it's set in a kind of rural area of the US, I think in the kind of Appalachian area. And it's got a number of different characters with a number of different subplots that kind of intertwine with each other. So the big head of the title is this kind of wild, almost like half-human creature that lives out in the woods, that attacks people, and those attacks are both, violent and sexually violent. So a creature that almost has no conception of normal morality and just acts purely on instinct. So you've got a kind of subplot about the big head who is kind of going on a bit of a quest. You've also got these two appalling guys who just travel around the country, cruise the roads, attacking people. So again, committing horrific acts of violence and sexual violence. You've got two young women, one of whom grew up in the area, who've travelled back to the area and are staying with the woman who lived in the area, staying with her aunt in a guest house that she runs. And then you've got a priest as well who's come to the area to reopen like an abandoned monastery, to open it up as kind of a new kind of Christian place for people who are recovering from various things. So he's come to the area as well. So very different people with very different storylines that kind of are woven together, as I say, throughout the book. But all of those storylines contain a lot of graphic sex and violence. It's a really, really graphic book. And it's certainly not a book that anybody could say wasn't extreme horror. Right from the start, right from the first sentence, it is shocking. There is some really messed up stuff in this book, and you definitely shouldn't read it if that kind of thing is not something that you can stomach. It's very, very graphic. It's very imaginative in its violence, and it is full of rape and sexual violence as well. It doesn't pull any punches at all. But what it does do, which is I guess my preference for books with this kind of content. I don't mind books with shocking content. One of the problems I've had with extreme horror more generally is that it tends to dwell on that violence. It tends to dwell on the appalling acts that it is portraying. And I think the best disturbing fiction, the best extreme horror is the kind of book that doesn't do that tells you something really appalling is happening, but then doesn't spend pages and pages describing that. So something like The Slob by Erin Beauregard, which I read a couple of years ago and didn't get on with at all, just spends forever describing these appalling acts. Whereas The Bighead gets them over fairly quickly. They are absolutely horrific, the things that are described, but they are described in just a few sentences rather than pages and pages and pages. So it gives itself time to have a story, to have a plot, to have character development, as well as having scenes of extreme violence. So that is definitely something that I think it does well. My other problem with extreme horror, as I kind of alluded to at the start, is I think a lot of it feels like it is doing what it does just to be shocking, like the authors. And I'm thinking here of people like, you know, Matt Shaw, Aaron Beauregard to an extent, although I think Aaron Beauregard's writing can be quite good. And John Athan is another extreme horror writer whose work I've tried and not particularly enjoyed. It feels like what they are trying to do is just get as much horrific, shocking content onto the page as possible. And there is definitely, you know, power in just being shocking when it is done well, but I don't think they necessarily do it well either. It feels like they're just trying to be as outrageous as possible in order to sell books. And, you know, certainly some of them seem to make a career of doing that. They have, you know, have a lot of fans, a lot of people who enjoy that kind of thing, and, you know, get reasonable book sales as a result of that. But it's not something that appeals to me particularly. I like there to be something a bit more, even if it's just a decent storyline, to go with the extreme horror. A book I read quite recently, Survivor by J.F. Gonzalez, does have a bit more of a plot to go with that extreme violence, but for me it was a plot that just wasn't interesting or satisfying. The thing that's great about The Bighead is because it's got these interwoven plots, and there's an element of suspense to see how these different storylines come together, and that keeps you reading throughout, you know, through the really horrific scenes. You kind of want to get through those in order to find out how these various character arcs will merge together at the end of the book. And that is something that, you know, as a reader really, really appeals to me. It definitely kept me reading the book. The other problem I have with a lot of extreme horror is that it uses humour in a way which doesn't really work. It has, you know, quite often these writers will have things that they think are funny in these books, which actually, for me at least, aren't funny. They don't work, and they can distract from the horror as well. The thing that's great about The Bighead is that there is quite a lot of humour in the book, and it is genuinely funny, but it doesn't pull you back from the horror of what is going on. In particular, towards the end of the book, there's some very, very humorous chapters with the priest, which had me like literally laughing out loud in a way that, you know, surprised me. I wasn't expecting that from this book. So there's some black humour. There's definitely black humour, but there's some black humour in this book which really works as well. So it feels like a complete package. It's got interesting characters. It's got that suspense of their storylines coming together. It's got, you know, very graphic but imaginative and at times quite interesting violence, and it's got that humour. But the thing I thought it did brilliantly was it feels like it has a purpose by having these different characters in the book. And I don't want to come over as sounding like some kind of pretentious literary critic here, but I do feel like Edward Lee was trying to convey a message with this book. And what he does with these different characters is he discusses morality. So you have kind of different levels of understanding of morality throughout these different characters, and different ways of like having a moral code and dealing with that moral code. So the priest, for example, is at one extreme end of that. He is someone who absolutely understands the difference between right and wrong, and goes out of his way to make sure he adheres to those rules, even when temptation is put in his way. The Bighead, on the other hand, does appalling things, but doesn't realise they are appalling. He has no concept of morality. The two guys I talked about who travel around doing awful, awful things have a concept of morality. They know the difference between right and wrong, but they choose to do wrong. So, and you've got other characters that you know, fill in other parts, if you like, of that spectrum. And I thought that was really, really interesting, and definitely made me more engaged with the book. I felt like there was a purpose to the book to go along with that violence. And equally, without that violence, I don't think Edward Lee would have been able to convey the message as well as he did. It's a book that justifies its extremities by having a bit of a message to go with them. So those are my thoughts on The Bighead by Edward Lee. I really did think it was an interesting book. Let me know in the comments if you've read it. Let me know what you thought. And also, if you are a fan of extreme horror, drop some suggestions in there for other things you think that I might like. Anyway, I will leave it there and say, as always, thank you very much for watching. Hope you're safe and well out there. Hope you're reading good stuff. And I'll speak to you again very soon. Cheerio.